All of those breweries owe their history to this brewery in San Francisco in some respect. And what Fritz did by making a porter, when everybody was looking for lighter beers, Fritz made a porter. Then he made Liberty Ale. He brought back the concept of dry hopping.
Hi, it's Doug Piper here, and I've got one of my favorite guests, Scott Ungerman, because he was the brewmaster at Anchor Steam, which has been in the news a lot. And Scott's been nice enough to join us again. Now, who is Scott? Let me just give you a little detail. Scott's journey to become the brewmaster and vice president of production at Anchor started in 2014 to 2020. And it all started from a college brewery tour that just ignited a love for homebrewing. He pursued a degree at the University of California, Davis, worked at Anheuser-Busch, and by a chance conversation, it led him to his role at Anchor Brewing. So, Scott, I'm thrilled to have you on here. I hope you're doing okay today.
Yeah, I'm doing great.
Can you jump into the history? I don't know that everybody appreciates. There are not many breweries in the United States with the legacy that Anchor has. Can you help us appreciate that?
Yeah, so Anchor Brewing actually traces their roots all the way back to the Gold Rush time in San Francisco when the first breweries were opened on the west coast of California. As gold was discovered on the west coast, people flocked to California to go find their riches. They came from not just the eastern United States, but actually from all over the world, and often by boat. And there were quite a few Europeans who came, and when they came and discovered a land with no beer, they built their own breweries. There had been, the missions were established centuries earlier on the west coast by the Spanish, and they had planted grapes and they made wine, but they never really made beer, and there wasn't really the infrastructure to make beer on the west coast. So notably, when Germans arrived, they brought with them their lager beer recipes, and they brought with them their lager yeast, and they founded breweries by the dozens, really, because thirsty miners needed beer. And so Anchor was one of many small breweries that popped up, and it wasn't actually called Anchor Brewing. It was founded in the 1870s, but it was not until 1896 that they changed the names. When the brewery changed hands, and two German immigrants, Baruth and Schinkel, the brewery fell into their hands, and they renamed it Anchor Brewing in 1896. So really that's when Anchor Brewing traces its roots to, as the oldest brewery in California, oldest brewery on the West Coast. And as a San Francisco brewery, they brewed a particular style of beer that grew to be known as steam beer. And steam beer was brewed on the West Coast, primarily with no refrigeration. They were making lagers, but making them in a unique new style, and so steam beer rose to prominence all up and down the West Coast, but specifically in San Francisco, and was the most popular style of beer all the way from the 1850s into up until the time of Prohibition. That's what most breweries were in San Francisco. They were steam beer breweries. And what is steam beer? How do we define that? Essentially, it's a lager made in a style where the fermentation is open and warm, and generally in San Francisco, that was at the prevailing temperature of San Francisco, which was until things have accelerated recently, but was always 60 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. And so that's the temperature, the magical temperature at which steam beer begins to ferment. And so Steam beer is considered to be a hybrid style of lager that's fermented at ale temperatures, and it was literally wiped out from the West Coast, as all beer was, when Prohibition happened. And when Prohibition was repealed in the 30s, very few steam beer breweries came back on the West Coast, but Anchor was one of them. And they struggled their way through the 30s, 40s, 50s, closed for a short time in the 50s, and steam beer was no more, but they reopened in the late 50s, and the brewery was on its deathbed again in 1965 when a man named Fritz Maytag found out that Anchor was dying and rescued the brewery. He bought the brewery, first half of it, and then the rest of it shortly thereafter, and really brought it back from a style of beer becoming extinct. And Fritz Maytag, in doing that, really was the godfather of the craft beer revolution in America, and revived a brewery making a style that was hardly known of outside of San Francisco. And then he brought many other styles on the scene in the 70s, and really developed a following and built a brewery out of the ashes of a brewery, and that's where we find ourselves again today.
Wow. I mean, that is a colorful history. And I want you to know, I was doing my homework last night, and Anchor is fascinating to me. Their beers, particularly steam beer, is a lager, but it has yeast-forward aromas, which is, kind of counterintuitive to a lager. Can you share more information, I guess, on that yeast? Because you already talked about the magical temperature, and then it's a lager that actually is fruity. That's crazy. Tell me more about it.
Okay. Yeah, steam beer is a very unique beer. Anchor Steam specifically it's an amber colored lager made with some caramel malt and all pale two row in that caramel malt. It's an all malt beer. It's not particularly hop forward, but it has a nice well-rounded bitterness with a little bit of a hop bite, I'd say, in the flavor, but without the aromatics of the hops overtaking the beer. The yeast character is definitely there, and that's that warm, estery fermentation. It's a shallow, open pan fermenter, very unique geometry, and fermenter geometry does have a lot to do with flavor and aromatics that come out from fermentation specifically. And that warm fermentation with a lager yeast in a shallow pan fermenter that's allowed to free rise. And what I mean by free rise is the heat of fermentation as the yeast begins to work. It warms up the actual fermenter. These fermenters, they're shallow pans that do not have cooling jackets, so the room is cooled. The room is cooled to an even year-round 60 degrees. And once again, sorry, everything in Fahrenheit. If you need some Celsius, you got to do some conversions there. But the fermentation itself warms up to much warmer than the room temperature. So the room is contained, and the only cooling you get is evaporative cooling off the top of the fermentation. But the fermentation itself warms up to 10 to 15 degrees warmer than the actual air temperature. And it's a quick fermentation because of that. So it's a 3-day primary fermentation in that shallow pan fermenter, and the yeast eventually settles down in the bottom. There's a central like divot all up and down the bottom of the fermenter, where the yeast will settle. And you can see it. You can see when you. It was a very visual fermentation. That's one of the nice things about having an open fermentation. I know we did some time lapse, and they're probably out there somewhere that you can see a time lapse of this fermentation. But essentially, what you would see is on day one, there'd be it foams up, vigorously foams up, and creates a nice white pillowy foam all along the top of this. If you can imagine an open fermenter the size of a Olympic-sized swimming pool, covered with foam on the top. And then as the foam began to subside, you'd see a stripe down the middle where the yeast is in that central furrow, because the yeast is a bottom fermenting yeast. It would settle down, and that was actually the yeast that we would crop, was what settled into the middle of the tank. And so that would be collected then after the end. And by day 3, you'd have it flat as a lake, done with primary fermentation, and then we would drop it down to the cellar. And when I say drop, that is a term used often for pumping from primary to secondary. But there were no pumps involved in this drop because it was a pure gravity drop from the 3rd floor down to the cellar, and the cellar tank's down on the 1st floor in the basement, essentially, of the building. And then secondary fermentation would happen down there in a closed tank, which is a much longer, slower, cooler secondary fermentation, but krausened, which is a very important part of the process. And what krausening requires is that on day 2, you start another fermentation that is a very quick fermentation, really about 18 hours before you're dropping a percentage of that freshly high krausen fermentation into the finished fermentation at an 85-15 ratio.
So you said it was a very visual. What did it look like, when fermentation was done? You said it was real pillowy.
It was pillowy on day 1, and then a stripe on day 2, and by day 3, yes, flat as a lake. No foam left. All of it drops. All the yeast drops to the bottom, and the foam.
And you said an Olympic-sized pool?
Yeah, the big ones, the 200-barrel tanks that we had upstairs were. It's visually, it appears to be. It's not quite that big, but. If you imagine 200 barrels of wort that's only about yay deep, 18 inches deep, maybe a little more than that, but not much. It's shallow, and the shallow head pressure is important for the formation of esters. If your yeast doesn't have a lot of osmotic pressure on it, it's gonna just ooze esters into the fermentation, and that's what it does. The esters are suppressed by many of those shallow or those narrow cylinder conical tanks that put a lot of head pressure on the yeast. Tend to suppress esters, but if you flatten everything out and don't put a lot of pressure on the yeast, then you get a nice estery beer.
I haven't seen a lot of open fermenters. I've seen the ones at Sierra Nevada. They've got 2 small ones, I think, compared to this.
Yeah, and they're much deeper.
20 feet across, as I recall. Mm-hmm. Theirs was in a glassed-in room, and I'm sure it was kind of controlled airflow in it. Was there ever an issue with contamination from the air? I know I saw Frank Bones in Belgium, and he had fans pulling the air across because, of course, that's what started it. Mm-hmm. What happens at Anchor? Was there ever a problem with?
It was a very clean room, and with positive pressure and filtered air, sterile filtered air, so that we cleaned the hell out of the room. We foamed the walls with chlorine and scrubbed the floors and kept everything as clean as we possibly could. It is a glassed-in room there at Anchor as well. So when on the brewery tour, you could walk right by it, but people had to go in there to pitch the yeast, to recover the yeast, to clean the tanks. But it was not open to the public. Those rooms were for operators only. Occasionally a VIP tour would take some people in there, but not too often. That was a sacred space, really, the fermentation room. And I was starting to say we also had open fermenters for the ale. We had different geometric shaped, deeper ones like at Sierra Nevada that we used for Liberty Ale and Porter.
Okay, so you didn't use the same big flat pan fermenters for Liberty or Porter.
No, no. The open fermenters, the shallow pan, the what we call the lager room, where we made Anchor Steam and California Lager in those open flat fermenters. Those are the only two beers that we made in there. The ale room was a different room with a different yeast and geometrically different shaped, much deeper, more like a traditional Yorkshire Square Old English fermenter.
Well, Scott, I know this yeast preceded your working at Anchor, but did you ever hear any stories about where Fritz got that very unique yeast?
Yeah, when Fritz bought the brewery in 1965, the yeast was one of the problems. They had contaminated the yeast, and they had beer that was frequently microbiologically troubled. It's one of the first things Fritz did was find a steady supply of yeast. He actually used yeast from neighboring breweries in San Francisco in the 70s. In the 60s and 70s, there were various other large lager breweries. Lucky Lager was made there. There was a Hams brewery, a Pabst, and Acme, and they all had their own particular yeast strains. And Fritz was somehow was able to talk them into giving him yeast from various different breweries at various times when he was, when he hadn't brewed for a while and his yeast health was bad. He'd go get some more from another local brewery. That the White Labs and Y Yeast of the world didn't exist back then. He had to improvise. He had to rely on friends and neighbors. And he tells the story much better than I do. But essentially, the story is that he didn't remember who he last got it from. Sometime in the late 70s or early 80s, his volume got to be enough, and his process began to be repeatable enough, such that he could collect his own yeast and never have to borrow yeast again, never have to beg or borrow. And so it happened at some point, and it's lost to history. When he told the story, I was lucky enough to be able to listen to him tell the story, and he said, I'm sorry, but I don't know the origin, and it's not that I'm being cagey here. I just simply don't know where I got the yeast from, and that's I appreciate, and I hope I don't bastardize the story too much, but I don't know where it's from either. I do know that it always came from the last batch, and that the collecting and repitching of yeast, the serial repitching of yeast, went on for decades, with a yeast strain that obviously over that time would have developed its own characteristics and was very likely a mixed culture, and it just became stable. And what was collected off the bottom of each subsequent fermentation was repitched within a few days, because the brewery just kept running. You'd just pull the yeast off, store it, and we had brinks right there in the fermentation room, so that the yeast never left the room, other than there was upstairs and downstairs. And then there was one very important part of the Anchor yeast protocol was the acid washing of yeast, and taking the pH down very low, and doing an acid washing once a month really kept the yeast pure and clean.
Scott, did I hear you say they serial repitched for tens of years?
Yeah.
I mean, did I hear that right?
Yeah, and when you do the math on that, on generations,
Does anybody do that?
you know, I have to say that, Doug, everybody did that until Louis Pasteur came along and told people what yeast was. They collected the yeast and they repitched the yeast. That's the history of brewing. That's the way everybody did it for millennia. And it wasn't until very recently in our documented history that brewers began to put these rules around generations. I mean, there was no other place to get yeast other than the bottom of your last fermentation, or the top, as it may be, depending on the type of yeast. But yes, this is it works. It still works in the modern world, as long as you treat the yeast right. And this yeast was treated very well. It lived in a perfectly suited environment for it to thrive. It was given a clean wort source of moderate strength, made from all malt. So no necessary, no, it wasn't high gravity. It wasn't low gravity. It was very consistent, right? So it's the same thing. If you feed the yeast the same, it's like, I hate to use this analogy, but I feed my dog a very simple kibble, dog food. He eats the same meal every day, twice a day. And it's, perfectly tailored for him to get all the nutrients he needs. He doesn't have a varied diet. He lives a healthy lifestyle of walking a few miles every day and eating the same food. And yeast is the same. If you give it the same food every day and the same nutrient base, it lives in its perfect, as long as you treat it right. That's the key.
Well, speaking of that, can we get into some specifics? And I know it's been over 3 years since you were working at Anchor, but as best you can recall, can you describe kind of the pitch rates and maybe nutrients, that kind of thing?
Yeah, as I said, the nutrient base is just an all malt wort, with some calcium added and a little bit of zinc, and not much zinc. Zinc sulfate is what we used, and I can't tell you ppm, but low, a much lower zinc rate than what we used at Anheuser-Busch, and it's standard calcium sulfate addition, gypsum, and the temperature of pitching was for Anchor 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And then, as I said, it warmed up, free rise, and then it would cool back down as the activity slowed. The yeast was on the bottom of the tank in that center trough, and we had a specialized tool notched for collecting that yeast. The yeast would get collected and into a brink with a glycol jacket so that it could be kept very cold, close to freezing, in the brink, and repitched, hopefully within a couple of days, but sometimes not for a week, and that's fine. As I said, the acid washing once a week, with I can't remember the type of acid that we use, but a fairly gentle acid to take the pH down below 2. And then we would measure solids on it. We would check the viability. We had very good viability of our yeast. And we'd measure the solids so that we could achieve the desired pitch rate. Desired pitch rate, somewhere around 15 million cells, kind of standard pitch rate, 15 million cells per milliliter. And then, that's it. There's no special nutrients given to it. You don't need it with an all malt beer. The malt contains all the necessary nutrients for yeast growth and yeast health. And like I said, a little bit of zinc and calcium are also key, but nothing unusual. And hundreds of generations, thousands maybe even. I did the math at one point, and repitching twice a week is 100 generations a year. So do the math.
You said essentially you open the drain and then it goes down to the tanks in the basement. That's not typical lagering, though, is it? What are the temperatures and how long do they stay in those tanks?
So the temperature down in the lager cellar was also 60 degrees. So not super cold lagering. And once again, it's Krausening, so there's a little heat of fermentation, and tanks do have glycol jackets on them in the cellar to chill once you're done with primary or secondary fermentation. But the secondary fermentation was allowed at cellar temperature. And you just close the tanks off, and you get natural carbonation in the tank from that Krausening, and that secondary fermentation that occurs is really the key point of maturation of lagering. That you want that acidyl reduction and acetaldehyde reduction as the yeast takes those back up over the course of that 12-day secondary fermentation. It's not a super long lagering, but it could sit a lot longer. And once you put the cooling on a tank, and at the end of secondary fermentation, it can sit kind of indefinitely.
But secondary fermentation's at 60 degrees.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, 10 degrees
That's
warmer.
some lagering temperature.
10 degrees warmer than what we did at Anheuser-Busch. And that drove a quicker secondary fermentation that you can make steam beer in 2 weeks. 15 days, really. 3 plus 12. 3 primary.
Wow, grain to glass in 15 days.
Yeah.
For a lager.
Yes.
Wow. Well, can this, Scott, be replicated on either a commercial or even a homebrew scale? I realize somebody may buy those great big pans. Somebody could build some pans like that. But you as brewmaster, and you've had a lot of education and experience, if you were to try and replicate it yourself, but not, for obvious reasons, not copy what they did at Anchor, you would bring modern methods. Is that possible?
Yeah, I think it is. I think commercially you could do it. You would need to make some modifications to most breweries that exist today to make something like it, but I think it could be replicated on a commercial scale. The authenticity factor wouldn't really be there unless you did the open fermentation, and unless you, I mean, can you make a California Common in a cylinder conical tank? I think the answer to that is kind of, not specifically exactly, but if you had a horizontal fermenter, and what I'm thinking about is at Anheuser-Busch we had various different styles and geometries of fermenters. We had horizontal bread box shaped fairly large fermenters, but they were shallow. And if you only half filled one of those and left no head pressure on it, that's essentially an open fermentation with a closed tank.
Okay. So we were talking about Sierra Nevadas, which I've seen a number of times. I think they're roughly 15 or 20 feet across and I thought I remembered the depth that they fill it to is like 4 to 5 feet. Would that come close?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and you never have to. You don't always have to fill a tank all the way, right? You could fill it. You could fill it to just 3 feet if you really wanted to. You'd just be leaving a lot of headspace in your fermenter, and it would make it impossible to collect the CO2 off those fermenters. But it was impossible to collect the CO2 off of our open fermenters. And it's one of the things that kind of hurts the carbon footprint of the brewery. But in order to authentically make that style, kind of what you have to do.
Okay. So there's kind of what's authentic, and then there's what's practical.
Yeah.
As we look at that and talk about practical, what about a home brewer? If you were to suggest a home brewing 5-gallon process, and I know your expertise goes well beyond home brewing, but if you were to try and set it up like a pilot or something, how would you do it? What would you recommend?
The really tricky thing in home brewing is to figure out how to get the Krausening ratio and how to because really that is one of the keys to this beer is that it's Krausened, and unless you have a very creative way to do that with another small batch, smaller fermentation that you're going to start a couple days later and then add in and close it up into a third vessel, it can be done, but it's gonna take some creativity and a very unique setup. But it is also probably very, very difficult to keep it clean unless you have, some, you build your own. And once again, it doesn't have to be a clean room, but you need that positive pressure, air flow, filtered air, or you've got to put it in a closed fermentation and just, make wort that approximates Anchor steam, but realize that fermentation-wise, you're not going to be able to do the same thing.
But that Krausening is essential to the profile.
Yes, it is.
Well, as we kind of zero in on this a little further, have you seen any accurate recipes of steam or porter or Christmas ale? I mean, I think there's going to be increased interest in brewing these ourselves now that we can't get them. But it sounds like, you're saying it's almost impossible to replicate steam. Porter, I would hope, might be easier, and Christmas might be easier. Where's the source of accurate recipes?
So Brew Your Own magazine, there's a guy named Dave Lowe who I talked to just recently, and he's putting together something right now on Christmas ale that should be in whatever their next edition comes out. He didn't give me a press time for that, but he also talked to Mark Carpenter back in 2014, and Mark was the brewmaster prior to me, and Mark gave him some recipes, so those are out there too. And I think at that point they didn't talk about Christmas ale, and that's why Dave wanted to have me run through some Christmas ale scenarios with him, which was a lot of fun. But in that case, I did not give him an exact recipe. I just kind of talked through, these are some of the things we used and some of the things we may have used. The fact that I can't remember any one specific Christmas ale actually helps protect the secrecy of those recipes. But it's not intentionally important right now that we protect the secrecy, but I don't think that any of them can be specifically exactly recreated. There are things that we did that we would do kind of for a couple of years, and then that thing would go away. So there were so many different spices and other ingredients that we had at our disposal. Part of the fun with Christmas ale is playing with it, and I I think that anybody who wants to make their own Christmas ale should definitely devise their own recipe of things that they like. And, to specifically say, I want to use cardamom because Anchor used cardamom, from 2012 to 2017. I don't know that for sure. But I know we did use cardamom at some point in there. And when we did, we put it in the mash. I know that, but I don't remember how much or which years. Other things that we used, orange flower water. What a fun one that was. Little tiny bottles of orange flower water. We were really glad when we stopped using that because it was an absolute pain in the ass.
Orange flower water?
Orange flower water, yeah. It's a very unique and very powerful. Like a little bit goes a long way.
What the heck is orange flower water?
I don't even know where we got it, Doug. You'd have to look it up.
Well, I mean, is it orange blossoms?
Yeah. It's like it's very
made into a tincture.
Yeah, it's a tincture. It's a very powerful aromatic that does smell like orange blossom. It's amazing. It's amazing stuff. But a little goes a long way. You don't want to overpower your beer with too many. And we were accused of that occasionally, of going a little heavy-handed. But the nice thing about that is if you let the beer age a little bit, they mute over time. And I think that's why that beer aged so well and why people like to age it was that some of those beers that were really intense the first time you opened them in November, if you happened to hang on to one for a couple of months and had it in late January, it was absolutely delicious. And then if you hung on to it for a whole year, it was still pretty damn good. But people often held on to them for 2, 3, 5, 7 years, and those they went downhill after 3 years pretty fast.
I could see that. Well, you haven't mentioned porter too much. Are there any accurate recipes for porter? That sounds especially important because
the porter recipe is out there as well. The one that Mark Carpenter helped with Brew Your Own. So I know that's out there. And porter, the one unique thing that we did at the brewery that, once again, you can't really do at home, was that we krausened it with steam beer. So it was a krausened porter, which is very unique. So the wort from the primary fermentation of porter was darker, roastier. And then you add that 15% steam beer, and it really changes. It makes it more velvety and really just smooths out the beer. And I think that's one of the things that you can't fully recreate, but you could try. And one thing is to back off on those dark malts to where they're less over the top. I think that many people, when brewing porters and stouts, lean a little heavy-handed on the dark malts and over roast. And when you get that over roasted tannic note, it takes away from the drinkability of the beer.
Yeah, I did my homework last night, as I was telling you. I was with 2 brewers, and we opened up a porter, and we were fascinated with almost no roast characteristic, but it was kind of plummy, and I loved it. I mean, I thought it was a great, but I was just shocked how it could be as.
Hold up that bottle again for me. That's the porter you drank last night? So that's the old label. So
no. This is one out of my bottle collection.
Okay.
I didn't save the one from last night.
Okay.
But it was just it had a slight plum character, more almost like a dark toffee. No real roast character. Yet it was as dark as maple syrup, and it was just fascinating to me that. You just don't have porters like that are that mild in the dark malts.
Yeah, I was gonna guess that your porter might have quite a bit of age on it. And when I saw that label, I thought, oh my gosh, that's from prior to the rebrand. That's at least a 2-year-old beer. But without knowing that, some of what you're describing could happen to the beer as it ages. Certainly, the plummy note, and it's probably any porter that you find out there on the East Coast is of questionable age, and and certainly will be going forward.
Yeah.
But it is that lack of over the top roastiness that I would attribute to Krausening with steam beer and not being so heavy handed on the roasted malts to start with. It was definitely a hallmark of that beer. It was,
And it's also not very hop forward, which
oh,
I
no, it's not.
appreciate.
No, it's not at all. It's got a nice amount of bitterness, but there's no dry hopping in that beer, and it's just some late hops in the boil. And no, it's not a beer designed to be hop forward. It was a malt forward beer, and that is still Fritz's original recipe from 1970, 72, 74, sometime in the early 70s, certainly. So, and nothing, we never changed the recipe, and it's a delicious beer.
Well, Scott, as we wrap up, and I appreciate your generosity of your time, what would you say we have lost? And I guess we don't exactly know what's going to happen with Anchor, but were it to completely close and never be reopened again, and somebody not try and replicate it in some way, what will we have lost as craft beer aficionados?
It's quite a bit that we've lost, and I can say, there is a group, at least one group, vying to reopen the brewery with the same employees making the same beer. They're trying, and how that process is going to go, I can't predict. I do know that there are others that want to just buy the real estate, and that's an assumption that is, I think, a valid assumption. And there may be some groups out there that want to buy the brands and have a go at making it somewhere else. So any of those possibilities still exist, but it's a complicated process that involves a third-party liquidator that is going to evaluate either an offer for the whole thing or offers to split it all up. And how that plays out, we will all have to wait and see. But assuming, as you said, that it doesn't open as the same entity with the same people making the same beer by the same recipes, which is, a very likely possibility. Then what have we lost? We've lost really a place that it's a place and an identity that is historical in the sense of this is how American craft beer evolved. The American brewing landscape in 1965, when Fritz Maytag bought Anchor, was a handful of breweries, the larger breweries getting bigger and the smaller breweries closing their doors. That trend reversed over the decades that followed, largely because of what Fritz did in San Francisco. What he did, he showed people that you could make beers other than light crushable lagers for the American public. The American public was interested in a different taste profile once they awakened their senses to it, and once homebrewing became popular, and once became a few small brew pubs here and there, to the landscape we have today with 10,000 breweries in America, a brew pub in every town, more than one in several. In this small college town of Davis, there's a half dozen breweries now. And there was one when I went to school here. And San Francisco itself had I looked at an article the other day that showed that in the mid 80s there were 3 breweries in San Francisco, 3 breweries left. One of them was Anchor. And when I started at Anchor in 2014, there were 20 breweries in San Francisco. So it blossomed, not just in San Francisco and Davis, but all over the country. Your small town, wherever you are, you can find a brewery in America. And all of those breweries owe their history to this brewery in San Francisco in some respect. And what Fritz did by making a porter, when everybody was looking for lighter beers, Fritz made a porter. Then he made Liberty Ale. He brought back the concept of dry hopping, which he devised his own method for dry hopping that others followed, and then blew right past. And the hop forward beers that we have today all trace their lineage back to Liberty Ale. And all of those things that Fritz helped along with this brewery in San Francisco. And he bought a building in San Francisco that was a coffee roastery and turned it into a brewery. And now it sits vacant and waiting to see what happens next. And we don't know what happens next. So that's what we've lost. And we've lost the generations upon generations of repitching that same yeast. That, the yeast has been captured. A snapshot of it anyway is on a slant in a yeast library, and it can be brought back to life. But will it be the same? There's no telling.
Scott, when we first met in our first interview, you were actually in Fritz's office. And I remember the reverence that you had for that office and that desk and the mementos in there. If Anchor or the Sapporo, I guess, were to contact you and say, Scott, we really appreciate your years of service at Anchor. We want to invite you to come in and take a memento. You can have anything in the brewery you want. What would you pick?
Some of those things are already gone, and some of them, it's interesting because I was there just a couple weeks ago. There was the last day that Public Taps was open. They had kind of a friends and family event, and a lot of people came back to the brewery. And I came back to go to that event, and I picked up one of the things that I had left behind, and that was my jacket, my Anchor jacket with my name on it. I had left hanging in that office, in Fritz's old office. I left it. There was a coat tree there, and I left it there on my last day in 2020, and I went and got it back. So I have that, and I have a 6-pack from the last bottling day. There are other things, various other things I left behind, including some pictures. I took a picture of one, but I left it on the wall, and it was a picture of Tom Littig, who worked there as our cellar master, was his last job. And he's a guy who died with his boots on. I felt like leaving that picture there was like leaving a ghost to haunt the place. And Mr. Littig, I hope he's resting in peace. But if his ghost is literally roaming that brewery, that makes me feel good too.
Well, I can see the emotion in your eyes. It is a sad loss, but it will live on as long as you keep sharing these stories and giving us more details. I hope we can maybe talk again when something exciting, hopefully, is happening at Anchor.
Yeah, I have hope that that the people that are trying to rescue the brewery are going to be successful, and that it will crank right back up on Potrero Hill, making steam beer.
Well, Scott, I appreciate it so much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your stories. Appreciate our other interviews, and I look forward to see you're now in distilling, right?
I was working for a company called Bespoken, but I left that role last year, and I'm currently working on some writing and consulting, and I'm going to do some teaching. So kind of a three-pronged approach to how I move forward.
Well, good. Well, keep us in mind when something exciting happens, and we look forward to hearing from you again soon.
All right.